So today we're wrapping up our conversation about Gideon. As we see, he turns down the offer to be a king, but he also reestablishes the worship of God in his community.
Which is fabulous. That's exactly what he was supposed to do. The problem is he makes some really serious mistakes, a couple of them that has negative effects for a generation. So that's what we're going to see next on HC Daily.
You're listening to another episode of HC Daily, a daily devotional podcast that you can listen to at home or on the go. We believe that you can grow as much as you want to grow spiritually, and this podcast can be a part of your daily growth plan. So, whether you're watching on YouTube, listening on Spotify or your favorite podcast app, we're glad you're here. Now, let's join our hosts, Jeff Forester and Chris Zarbaugh, in the studio.
So, Chris, I mentioned the other day how many of your fan and loyal follower love to pay attention to just the smallest details in your life.
Yes.
And I asked about superheroes. We've talked about food. We've talked about these things. But one thing that maybe a lot of people don't know is that you're a real animal lover.
I do.
You love animals, man.
Yes.
You have a few pets at home.
I do.
Right. So I was just wondering, and this has been an issue in my mind for a long time. I think our listeners are going to be interested in your thoughts about this too. If animals could talk, which animal would be the rudest?
Chihuahuas.
Chihuahua, you didn't even think about it.
They're already the rudest.
You didn't even have to think about
The
that.
yippy dogs who bite at your ankles and just yap and yap and yap. Yeah. You know why? Because they remind me of the people who their voices are louder than their demeanor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, the people in life where, they always complain and whine. Like these Chihuahuas can't do anything, right? So they're just always barking and yipping and making trouble and, shaking and peeing everywhere. Come on. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So you don't think that they're just super nervous and that's why they bark all the time?
Could be. Yeah. I'm just making fun.
So I've always thought that cats would be the rudest because they mostly are annoyed by you, right?
Yeah.
Hey, it's time to feed me. Hey, leave me alone. Don't touch me.
Yes.
Right? That kind of thing.
And they knock things off tables and they're just like, hey, I don't care about this thing. Whack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, it's either Chihuahuas or cats. Well, I'll concede that one. No, I think that was important. Our listeners are very dialed into your opinions about these things. So
yeah, that's funny.
Here we are. We're going to read from today, Judges chapter 8. We're going to kind of wrap up the life of Gideon. And some big events happen here.
Yeah, we've been talking about him for this will be the third day, and this is after God had given him the victory, and and God wants him to set up a dynasty. And we're going to see that he actually makes some serious mistakes today. Yeah, even though that he was a good ruler in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. So this is Judges chapter 8. I'm going to read from the NLT version, starting with verse number 22. Then the Israelites said to Gideon, "Be our ruler. You and your son and your grandson will be our rulers, and you have rescued us from Midian." Gideon replied, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son. The Lord will rule over you. However, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from the plunder that you collected from your fallen enemies." The enemies, being the Ishmaelites, all wore gold earrings. "Gladly," they replied. They spread out a cloak, and each one threw a gold earring he had gathered from the plunder. The weight of the gold earrings was 43 pounds, not including the royal ornaments or the pennants, or the purple clothing worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains around the necks of their camels. Wow, camels. Gideon made a sacred ephod from the gold and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. But soon all the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a trap for Gideon and his family. That is the story of how the people of Israel defeated Midian, which never recovered. Throughout the rest of Gideon's lifetime, about 40 years, there was peace in the land. Then Gideon, son of Joash, returned home. He had 70 sons born to him, and he had many wives, and he also had a concubine in Shechem, who gave birth to a son, whom he named Abimelech. Gideon died when he was very old, and he was buried in the grave of his father Joash at Ophrah, in the land of the clan of Abiezer. As soon as Gideon died, the Israelites prostituted themselves by worshiping the images of Baal, making Baal Berith their god. They forgot the Lord their God, who had rescued them from their surrounding enemies. nor did they show any loyalty to the family of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, despite all the good he had done for Israel.
Man, he started off so well.
Yes, he really, really did. And so this really is a sort of, a bittersweet passage, because it says that, there was peace in the land for 40 years. And Gideon, he tried to rule, but at the same time, he gave into the culture because he married a bunch of wives. He had a concubine.
Yeah.
And even though the Bible includes that, it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that that is a good thing.
As a matter of fact, it says that kings and leaders should not have a bunch of wives.
That's right.
And,
it does.
And keep a bunch of concubines. So it's exactly the opposite. It actually says don't do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet that's what Gideon did. And he sort of, I think, probably got a little consumed with the whole title, just, acting like a king and having a lot of pride. And even though that he didn't want to be the ruler, it seemed like he really, he and his son sort of really enjoyed the power.
Well, I think that power is such a tempting thing that in his mind, his heart told him, don't do it. Mm-hmm. Right? They offered him a dynasty.
Right.
Not, his family was set up if he would step into it. They at the invitation said, we want at least you, your son, and your grandson to lead us. Right. And he had the wisdom to say no to that. He just didn't have the wisdom to avoid living like that.
Right.
Right. And so what you have is, I think he loses sight of the Lord's leading. You're not seeing him really lean in at this point and saying, God, what do you want me to do? Remember before, the angel tells him, hey, you're going to be a great warrior, and he argues with him 3 or 4 times. Right. Then God says, I want you to go fight the Midianites. He goes, hey, would you do this with the fleece? Oh, wait a minute. I don't mean to offend you, but would you do it again? Right. Right? He's really leaning in, making sure he's hearing from God. And suddenly here, there's no prayer. There's no prayer about what should he do about leadership. There's no prayer about what should he do about spiritual engagement in the community. Instead, he just steps up and says, okay, I'm not going to be your king, but why don't you everybody give me a little bit of gold?
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that, a lot of times in those days, wealth was taken over. So when you plundered a city and you took over a city, oftentimes the people would flee, those who weren't already killed, and they would leave behind all their possessions. And a lot of times that's how people would, get plunders. And so it says here that there was gold around the camels' necks, which means there was a lot of wealth with the Midianites. And so how much would this have been? If everybody took off an earring and they went ahead and gave it to Gideon, but really, what Gideon is saying is, I don't want to be your ruler. I just want to be really rich.
So I did the math on this. So, and this wasn't even for him.
Right.
Right. So to put it in perspective, they killed 135,000 soldiers. They were Ishmaelites, and the Ishmaelites always wore earrings in their ears, men and women. And that was so that they would remind themselves to listen to their gods, by the way. I don't know if you knew that, but that was what they did. So just from that, they went through, after the war was over, and they collect from the bodies, the dead bodies, the plunder, the spoils, and then everybody pitched in one earring. So he only had 300 soldiers. Plus, then you had a bunch of the other tribes that come and helped kind of clean up the mess at the end. So everybody pitches in an earring, and it winds up being 43 pounds. I did the math, by the way, on this last night. So yesterday's spot gold price, it winds up being about 19.4 kilos, and the spot price for a kilo of gold yesterday was $61,185, which when you multiply that times 19.4 kilos, it's $1.186 million.
So it would have been equivalent to immediately getting $1 million in gold.
$1 million in gold, but not for himself. That means the people all became wealthy because of that battle.
Right.
Right. And he was wealthy as well. And because they just pitched in an earring apiece. That's what it says. Mm-hmm. They pitched in an earring apiece, and the total wound up being over $1 million. So the people were pretty well off at this point. And what he wanted to do is he wanted to make an ephod from it. An ephod was, it's described in the law of Moses. The high priest would wear this. It was like a breastplate. It had jewels on it, and it was kind of a thing that represented. It was a holy relic. It would represent God's presence and power and knowledge and wisdom in the life of the people from the high priest. The problem was the high priest wasn't in this town. The high priest was in Shiloh. The high priest is where the tabernacle was. And it was only for the high priest. It wasn't for just general people to do this. So he does not ask God, how do you want me to worship you? Instead, he says, this is how we're going to worship God. And it became a trap to them because people weren't worshiping God. They began worshiping this relic.
Right. Yeah, and I just read somewhere that an ephod could be also viewed as like an apron. So it's a breastplate, but it could also be extended. Yeah. And so I imagine that this was very, shiny, right? It's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
It was probably very beautiful.
Yeah.
They were craftsmen. And so they were used to worshiping, false images and, and the Asherah pole, the altars of Baal, the false gods, they're used to an image. They're used to something tangible that they can look at and worship. So here, Gideon makes this ephod, and they're like, oh, this is our new thing to worship. And so they worship this thing rather than, the giver of the battle. So it's just pretty amazing to me how, we sort of see Gideon's reign. There's peace in the land. There's victory. Yeah. And everything sort of plays out well that way. And yet at the same time, just like you said, there's no evidence of God speaking. There's there are no stories of Gideon consulting or, living with the high priest, informing him, anything like that. It just says he just enjoyed life, apparently.
Right.
Had a bunch of wives, had 70 kids.
Yeah, 70 kids. So again, I think his intentions with the ephod were good intentions. Hey, the priests, the high priest wears an ephod at the tabernacle. Let's have something like that here, and people remember that God gave us his victory. But as people do, sometimes we worship the relics and we begin to think of them as good luck charms rather than the victory giver. We just look at that thing and go, okay, wow, we're going to worship this. And I think people can do that with religious relics as well. Whether it's, people thinking that wearing a cross around their neck's a good luck charm, or keeping a certain kind of thing on their dashboard for safety, all those kinds of things. We're moving past the gift giver, and we're looking at this thing that reminds us of him, and now it's what we're hoping will give us good luck, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I get people all the time, I'm sure you do too, over the past 3 decades, they'll come up and they'll say, hey, will you bless this cross?
Right.
Will you bless this item? And I think it's important for our listeners to understand, there are no blessed objects. In fact, the Bible says that, every blessing has been given. So it's not, in fact, Jesus never even said, bless the food. Right. It always says he said he gave thanks for the food.
That's right.
So every time we say bless this food, it's technically and theologically incorrect, by the way.
Yeah.
And so it really is. Nobody's going to condemn you for saying bless this food. We all say it, right? But I've not said it. I've tried to avoid it because it's theologically not correct. So people come up and they say, would you bless this cross I hang around my neck, or bless these wedding rings? And it's like, and I know that there are some traditions and some faiths and denominations that still believe that the priest or the rabbi or the pastor, has the ability to bless an object. But that is a thing of the past.
Right. God blesses people. Right. He doesn't bless things.
Right.
God blesses obedient people. God blesses holy people. God blesses submissive people, humble people. The Bible says God blesses humble people, but he doesn't bless things.
Right. So every time that happens to me, I will still pray over, and I'll just say, hey, you get this cross, that's great. Let me just pray that God will always use it to remind you of these things. And I'll sort of like take the object and sort of place on it this direct connection to where the focus should be, which is like, look at the cross, think of these things, think of who God is, think of how he works. And so I that's the way that I sort of respond to that. And it's really, really relevant here.
Yeah, it is. I think as leaders, it can be a mistake for us if we take something that we look at and say, hey, we have good intentions, that's good enough. Good intentions are not good enough. We have to seek God's wisdom, right? And we also have to look and think, I find myself oftentimes, not that I'm saying I'm a wise leader, but I oftentimes find myself thinking, not just, is this a good idea, but what are the potential consequences or fallout of that idea? And what we don't see, he doesn't seem to be looking past the moment here. He doesn't look past it and go, hey, listen, our people are consistently tempted by worshiping religious relics. So maybe I could find a different way to honor God. Let's build an altar. Let's make sure we all take a trip to Shiloh, to the tabernacle. He could have done something like that. He didn't. He didn't think past the moment. His good intentions were good, but he did not think through the potential consequences of that. And because he didn't pray about it, he chooses his own way to worship God. And I think that's a tremendous temptation for us as Christians.
So speaking of having great intentions and then it not working out because you haven't thought through it, discussed it, prayed about it. I always heard this old Baptist thing. I call them illustrations in a can. You know, when you read like a book and it says, tell the story that's not really a story, right?
Sure.
And I always heard this phrase in that culture that said, like, is there enough evidence to convict you of being a Christian if you were on trial? Have you heard that? Have you? Yeah. So it's just so old, and it's been around forever. You know, is there enough evidence in your life to convict you for being a Christian if you were on trial? Right. And so really what it's saying is like, you know, do you live like a Christian? Is there enough evidence on the outside? So the concept's great, right? So I decided to, in my own brilliance, to decide to hold a trial in this small church that we were part of. Our youth group was about maybe 60 people or so. And I was the prosecuting attorney. And Josh Eisenhart, my teenager, who's my good friend now, was the defending attorney. And I chose a kid named Ryan McGuire, the worship pastor's son, because he was a very controversial teenager. And I put him on trial. And I tried to say to him, hey, Ryan, you struggle in these 10 areas. And I asked him, would this be okay? And I ripped this guy to shreds. Like, there's not enough evidence to say that you're a Christian. And then Josh Eisenhart would come back and say, but, he has all these great things in his life. And then I thought that it'd be fun to have like a flag, a judge, a desk, the gavel, the whole thing. And then ultimately it was up to the jury, which was the whole youth group, to decide. This is a horrific idea.
That's a bad idea.
It's a horrific idea.
Doesn't Jesus say, "Judge not, that you be not judged"?
Oh, it was terrible.
Doesn't he say that?
It was terrible. Yeah. But it was the culture that I was in. It was good intentions, but
the road to where is paved with good intentions.
Right. Yeah. The road to hell. H-double.
Yeah. There you go.
So anyway, here's what happens. So it goes poorly. I have his mom and dad on the stand, by the way, too. Oh, no. Right. So they agreed to be a part of it because they trusted me. So it goes very poorly. We felt it in the room. I felt like it was terrible. It was a terrible idea. And then he goes, hey, Chris, I want you and your wife to come over for dinner at my house. Rick McGuire says this, our worship leader. And I was scared to death, thinking like, this guy is going to just tear me up, right? We get to his house. We sit through a 40-minute meal. And all he does is say, so, how's life going? He doesn't mention it. It's like the elephant in the room. I was sweating the entire time, thinking like, here comes the thunder, right? Right. He is going to tear me up and just say, this was a horrible idea. I'm waiting for the yelling. Here's what he says. At the end of this 40-minute meal, he looks at me and he goes, Chris, he said, let's talk about the other night. He goes, when you did this and you put my son on trial, he goes, we agreed to it because we love you and we trust you. He goes, I thought it was in poor taste. He goes, it didn't work out very well. It was a bad idea. He says, but you do a million things right, and you've done this one thing wrong. I just want you to know, I invited you over here tonight to let you know, I'm not going to hold you, to the fact that you've done this one thing wrong.
Wow.
When you've done so many things right for my son.
Wow.
That was the reason why he wanted me to feel okay about what the mistake that I had made. That's why he brought me over.
But he wanted you to sweat bullets for 45 minutes before he brought that up. He didn't lead with that.
I'm not sure that was. I'm not sure that was his tactic. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no. It wasn't.
It probably wasn't. Yeah. But he sure did that. He accomplished that. Yeah. So, but the point is, it was one of the biggest moments of my life, and I was a pastor at the time for at least 5 or 6 or 7 years, and I just remember thinking to myself, that is one of the biggest demonstrations of grace that I've ever seen. About good intentions that went the wrong way. Yeah. And I should have discussed it, prayed about it, got godly counsel, right? Yeah. Because I didn't realize till later on that was a pretty big choice I made that didn't go very well.
Yeah. It was a creative idea, but it went in the wrong direction. Yeah. Good intentions. So I think this is what you have with him with regard to the ephod. And then on top of that, he had a good heart saying, no, I'm not going to rule. but then apparently he was tempted by the tremendous amount of wealth that he got from this battle, and then also from the power and prestige he had with the people. So he started living like a king, even though he wasn't a king. Like you already mentioned, he married all these wives. He has 70 kids. He has a concubine in Shechem, and his concubine winds up having a son named Abimelech, who becomes a full-blown train wreck. We'll summarize his life in the next episode. But I think what happens is Gideon was so timid and so humble, and then suddenly after this victory, he has this sudden confidence and pride, and I think that caused him to behave like a king, and it set him and his family, his nation up for tragedy later.
Yeah, so a phrase that I learned from you is that, and I've heard you quote it so many times, is that we are free to make our own choices, but we are not free to choose the consequences.
That's right.
And it's such a great phrase. And you've said it in pretty big situations, when I made the transition over to Heritage Church.
Sure.
And you're like, hey, listen, people are free to make their own choices, but they're not free to choose the consequences of those choices.
Right.
And it's not just relevant for, the situations that I find myself in. And it's just a principle in life, isn't it?
Yes.
Like people, you can make your choices, but you have to realize that there are always going to be, effects that come from those choices. Some of them are good.
Yep.
And if it's the wrong choice, you're going to get bad consequences.
Well, you're going to see this in Abimelech in the next story. And then when we get to Samson,
Yeah.
every day.
Right.
That's the theme of the day.
Right. All right. So we'll see you next time as we cover Abimelech.
Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us spread the word by liking this episode and sharing it on your social media platforms. Be sure to leave a comment and review, and don't forget to give us 5 stars. When you do, you help us reach even more people who need a daily devotional like HC Daily. If you'd like to hear more from Chris and Jeff, they're both teaching pastors at Heritage Church, located in Southeast Michigan. You can get more of their messages by clicking on the Messages tab at heritagechurch.com. Be sure to join us again soon for another episode of HC Daily.